Welcome back to another episode of Conversations with Diplomats. My name is Kimberly Marten. I'm a professor at Barnard College, and I'm directing the program on U.S.-Russia relations here at the Harriman Institute at Columbia University. Today, I'm joined by Ambassador Jack Matlock. And Ambassador Matlock has such a wide variety of connections to Columbia. He earned his, what used to be called the Russia Institute, before we were the Harriman Institute, his Russia Institute certificate here at Columbia. He earned his PhD in Slavic languages here at Columbia. He was a professor at Columbia at the School of International and Public Affairs, and he's also taught a variety of classes over the years for the Harriman Institute itself. So welcome, Jack. It's wonderful to have you here today.
Wonderful to be back.
So a lot of our students dream about becoming ambassadors. How did you end up becoming U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union under Ronald Reagan?
Well, it was partly luck and partly the fact that I had a career preparing myself for it as a professional diplomat. One can never be sure how a career will work out at the end. There's a lot of chance involved, but it just happened that during the Reagan first administration, when Reagan decided it was time to negotiate with the Soviet Union, he and his staff realized they had no experienced specialist on it. And they asked the State Department they told me, your most experienced person. And at that point, I had probably spent longer dealing with Soviet affairs in the State Department than anyone else. So the Secretary of State recommended me for the position. And that meant that having worked on the National Security Council with the people in the administration and actually helped them design the policies, it was sort of almost automatic that when it was time to replace the ambassador that I would be named. But by that time, it was the fourth time I'd served in our American embassy. I had been director of Soviet affairs for 4 years in the State Department before I worked in the White House. And I was, serving in the Soviet Union was rather difficult in many respects for families. And my family was always willing to go back. And I always considered that my specialty. And it turned out that in the end, that paid off in the sense that it was recognized. I would have to say that there were plenty of well-qualified people who didn't. The luck didn't strike. Right. So you have to say it was luck, as well as the fact that throughout my career, I concentrated on dealing with the Soviet Union and expressing views, I think, that were not always the accepted ones within the State Department. And in part because I had specialized in Soviet internal affairs. Okay. And therefore, when there were changes and began to be changes, I was more sensitive to them than many of those who had only looked at one aspect of Soviet policy.
Oh, that's really interesting. So earlier you had also served as ambassador to Czechoslovakia back when Czechoslovakia was a unified country and a member of the Warsaw Pact. What was similar or different about those two ambassadorial appointments?
Well, first of all, the reason I was appointed to Prague was that Czech had been my second Slavic language here at Columbia. Okay. So I actually was one of the few Foreign Service officers, senior, who actually knew at least some Czech. Right. So that's one of the things. Of course, Prague was quite different from Moscow in a number of respects. I went to Prague when our relations with Czechoslovakia were very poor. It was after the Soviet invasion and crackdown, and yet the Czechoslovak government was run really by third-raters. Okay. And sort of in dealing with a communist country, you were, I would say it was much easier to, I would say, outwit them at times when we were in confrontational things than it was in the case of the Soviet Union. Wow, but you were always aware of the fact that you were not dealing with principals, that is the senior people, because the Soviet Union was determining Czechoslovak foreign policy.
Interesting.
So, and I think even the Czechoslovaks that we dealt with, many who were Slovaks rather than Czech at that time, were quite aware of that. So that gave it I would say, a different quality. So I spent my time there less dealing with the government. Obviously, I did on the things we needed to, but trying to get across to the people, the Czechs and the Slovaks. I would do speeches in both languages, usually 2/3 in Czech, 1/3 in Slovak to represent the thing. I could do Slovak with preparation. The languages are pretty close. And we tried to get across to the Czechs and Slovaks that we hadn't forgotten them. And that meant that, for example, when we celebrated VE Day, I would go to areas in Western Bohemia which had been liberated by Patton's forces, and give talks to people, and of course VOA and Radio Free Europe would put this on. I did all my public speeches in Czech and Slovak, depending on where I was. So it was trying to reach the people there, to remind them that we hadn't forgotten them, and that we were confident that someday they would be liberated.
Oh, wow. That is fantastic. And so the language skills were really crucial for you.
Absolutely.
So that's something our students should keep in mind. So you made the very unusual choice, and I would say the very brave choice, to come back to Columbia and finish your PhD after you had retired from the Foreign Service. Why did you decide to do that?
Well, first of all, I never completely gave it up. I had started writing a dissertation on the Soviet Writers' Union and its impact on Soviet literature. And actually, I'd done a good bit of research on that. But when I was in the Foreign Service and got to Moscow and began to meet the writers, it was clear to me I could not write an honest dissertation dealing with them without conflicting with my diplomatic
that makes a lot of sense.
So I thought I need something totally non-political. And so I got fascinated by Liskov, the 19th century writer, and I found his language particularly interesting and particularly difficult to translate. And the one translation in English by Isabel Hapgood was really very, very poor. So I then corresponded with Belknap, who was then chairman of the department, and said, could I change the dissertation topic? And one on translating Liskov and concentrating on Soberyanya. Well, it's translated variously: church, folk, or cathedral, clergy. But in any event, they approved this. And actually, when I was in Prague, I had it about 2/3 written.
Oh my goodness!
But then I was assigned to the NSC. You know, this is a 7-day-a-week job, and you're lucky if it's only 16 hours a day. And then ambassador in Moscow, which again, totally flat out. There's no way I could continue working on it. And then when I left the Foreign Service in '91, I was already committed in my mind and to others to write 2 books, one about how our policy developed toward the Soviet Union, and then when the Soviet Union collapsed, how it collapsed. And so I concentrated on those books first. And it was only after they had been finished. Later, Professor Nepomniachtchi finally said, Jack, you know, it's almost finished. Why the heck don't you finish it? And I thought, well, why not? Now I've done the other things. So, you know, it was 80% finished, probably maybe more than that. And so I finished it off, and they kindly offered the degree.
What a great story. That's wonderful.